am 20 years old and recently moved to a small apartment complex a few miles from my parents' house. I have never lived alone before. Therefore, this situation was new to me. The apartment was 3 stories tall and had 6 studio apartments. The only available apartment was on the top floor, so I had to go with it. I got everything to my apartment and relaxed a bit before bed. I think it was around 10:30 p.m. and I hadn't settled down and had dinner. I put some water on the stove to boil. While waiting, I heard the floor in front of my apartment creak softly. I wasn't sure whether the apartment made noises or someone was at my door. Either way, I figured out I should check in case someone was there. Slowly, I opened the door and said hello softly. An older man stood a few feet from my door with his back facing me. I assumed he lived in the neighboring apartment because the door was directly in front of mine where he was facing. A few seconds passed, and he turned softly and said, "Sorry." Then he began walking down the stairs. I closed the door and checked the water pot on the stove. I started to feel a bit uneasy because the man didn't enter the neighboring house. There would be no reason for someone to come to the top floor unless he lived there. I finished cooking dinner and tried not to think about it too much. I was excited to have my place and finally live alone. It was a big accomplishment, and I didn't want to be creeped out on my first night. I finished making my bed and turned the lights off. I stayed on my phone for a while before eventually dozing off. I could have fallen asleep at 11 or 12, but I'm not sure. However, I remember checking the clock at 1:29 a.m. when I woke up after hearing something from the room below mine. It sounded like the soft shuffling of footsteps. I lay there waiting to hear anything else. It took about 5 minutes before I heard the creaking floor in front of my room again. I was beginning to panic a bit, trying to remember over and over whether I locked my door earlier that night. As I waited in silence, I heard a creaking sound of the doorknob trying to turn. The door was locked, and I waited for anything further to happen, but I heard my neighbor's door open and then shut after a few seconds. Relieved, I jumped out of bed, double-checked whether my door was locked, and then went back to bed. It must have been the old man who possibly confused his door with mine. I heard a loud knock on my door in the morning. 2 police officers greeted me after opening the door. They asked whether I had experienced something unusual last night or if anything was missing. The man I saw last night had robbed 2 apartments whose owners forgot to lock their doors. I told the officers everything, and they walked downstairs after thanking me. I'm unsure if they arrested the man, but nothing has happened since then. Thinking about the situation makes me uneasy. I cannot help but wonder what would have happened if I had forgotten to lock my door that night. When I was a kid, 10 or 11 years old, my house was at the end of a road that ran against a large forest. I often ran around, played games, and walked with my friends behind the house. The forest was the densest of all the woody areas I had seen. The trees were too close together, and in some parts of the forest, it was hard to walk next to a friend without constantly moving behind or in front of them to pass between 2 trees. It was a regular Friday night, and I invited my friend to hang out since there was no school the next day. The sun was beginning to set by the time he came over, but we wanted to hang out together for a while before it got too dark. We grabbed some heavy flashlights just in case and headed for the trees. We walked for about 10 to 15 minutes before finding a fallen tree that we sat on and just talked. Sitting in the woods and talking about whatever we felt like was one of our favorite things for us to do. I don't remember how long we sat there because we got lost in the conversation. The forest was almost completely covered in darkness when I looked up. Neither of us was nervous because we knew our way around the forest before it got pitch black. We turned on our flashlights and started walking. I was a bit creeped out because it was completely silent, besides the crunch of the leaves from our footsteps. We could only see a few feet ahead because of the dense trees blocking the view. We stopped suddenly after walking for 2 to 3 minutes. We both heard the distinct sound of someone walking across the leaves ahead of us. It must have been behind the trees, 15 to 20 feet from where we stood. I wondered why someone would be going for a walk in the middle of the woods at that time of the night. I tried to remain calm, but the footsteps suddenly stopped when we thought the person was beginning to get further away. We both froze and looked at each other in fear and confusion. It felt as though everything had gone silent. I had a feeling I was in immediate danger as I stood there looking at my friend. I heard leaves crunching behind us a few seconds later. My instincts kicked in, and I took off running straight in the direction of our house, my shoulders constantly bumping into trees as I ran, because it was hard to navigate through them with barely any lights. I heard footsteps crunching the leaves behind me. I hoped it was my friend, but I was too scared to look back. After 30 seconds of running, I heard the footsteps take a sharp turn to the right and drift off the distance. What terrified me was that those footsteps weren't my friend's footsteps. I was wondering where he was and whether he was in trouble. I eventually reached my backyard and got into the house through the back door. I was breathless and peeked through the windows to see whether my friend would arrive. My parents came downstairs and asked me if I was fine after noticing the panicked look on my face. The doorbell rang as I was telling them what happened. My dad opened the door and my friend immediately pushed it and ran inside. He said he froze, not knowing what to do when I ran away. He heard 2 sets of footsteps go off in my direction after me. He decided to run towards our house. My parents called the police to report the incident, although nothing came out of it. We still talk about the incident, coming up with theories of what happened that night. Part of me wishes I should have looked back to see who was chasing me. It was on a Saturday night, and my friends and I were preparing to attend the opening act at a local bar music night. We lost track of time and realized we had to leave immediately lest we miss it. I hurriedly gathered my car keys and wallet. We rushed out of the house and got into the car. Luckily, we arrived at the bar just in time to see them enjoy the show. I patted my pockets down after a few drinks to check my phone, but it wasn't there. I checked all the pockets and asked my friends whether they had seen it. None had seen my phone, so we searched for it around the bar. We checked the tables and everywhere we had been. We eventually gave up. We tried to call it on one of my friend's phones. Someone answered after 2 rings. "Hello," I said after someone picked up the phone. The person on the other line didn't speak, although we could hear them breathing. I started to speak after a few seconds, but they immediately hung up. I was frustrated that someone had stolen my phone, but I decided to take care of the issue tomorrow since it was getting late. I could have done nothing at the moment. We left the bar about an hour later. I dropped my friends off at their homes and drove back home. As I was driving, I was running through my memory of the last time I had my phone on me. Pulling into the driveway, I remembered the last time I had my phone was on the bed as I prepared to leave for the show. The more I thought about my lost phone, the more I got creeped out as I got out of the car. I headed to the front door and unlocked it. I cautiously walked inside and slowly headed to the bedroom. I turned on the lights. Sure enough, my phone was on the bed where I previously thought I had left it. I searched the entire house for a trace of someone having been there, but I couldn't find anything. I had trouble sleeping that night. Even the slightest noise made me uneasy. I discussed it with my friends the following day, and they all concluded it was creepy. We also figured out that calling the police to report the issue wouldn't lead to anything. Therefore, we ended up leaving it at that. Nothing else ever happened in the following years, but it still keeps me awake sometimes, thinking about what happened with my phone that night.